Check the timestamp again. I submitted that veto 28 seconds before session lock. Strategist Corvin Halvik didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The chamber clerk, seated beneath a swath of blinking command strips, was already pale from running the review protocol 3 times. The ambient glow of the chamber's ceiling strips painted the man's forehead in waves of dull red. Status warnings were compiling, each pulse syncopated with Halvik's breath, slow and tight behind his clenched jaw. "I saw it with my own eyes," the clerk murmured, avoiding Halvik's gaze. "System confirms absence." "System confirms nothing." Halvik stepped closer, his footsteps sharp against the polished alloy floor. "System echoes what it's told. What matters is who spoke last." The Galactic Council's 980th session chamber was silent now, eerily so, the kind of quiet that followed staged applause. The central dais where delegates had gathered minutes ago, its ring of ascending tiers lined with laser plasma displays, stood vacant but active. Windows still scrolled updates, yet Earth's motion was missing. Not amended, not denied. Erased. Halvik turned, glancing up at the curved screen above the delegate tier. The vote log hovered in sleek gold script. Motion. 348, be ratified, unanimous, consent, His eyes narrowed. He'd uploaded Earth's veto from his station, using double-authenticated keys backed by Earth's economic ledger, supported by 74 cycles of funded infrastructure claims on the Ulith arc. Every pillar Earth had built in that corridor. Supply depots, conflict de-escalation relays, and multi-species transit exchanges had been logged, databanked, and approved by Council inspectors. All of it met Council criteria. And now all of it had been disregarded, not by vote, but by disappearance. He paced back toward his console. "Replay the sequence," he said flatly. The system complied. A heads-up playback hovered across the inner curve of the console barrier. It showed the moment he submitted Earth's veto, timestamp valid, input confirmed, data packet received. Then, no response, no rejection notice, no redirect, just a gap and then a universal approval. Halvik tapped his wrist console. The sub-screen flickered, displaying a diagnostic readout. "Request procedural review," he ordered. Request denied. Appeal window expired. Redirect issued. Dormant appeal node 4141A. A shell portal that hadn't accepted input since before the Harkin revolutions. A ghost mailbox. Halvik's pulse pounded behind his ears. He wasn't a diplomat. Earth hadn't sent him here for negotiation. He was a systems strategist, trained to navigate, not persuade. His appointment to the Council had unsettled more than a few veterans. But Earth didn't need charisma anymore. It needed accuracy. He recentered himself at his station. Initiate full audit request under procedural clause. Override rejected, the Council replied, its tone flat. Session authority has passed to archiving, all data finalized. The edge of his left hand trembled as it pressed into the cold steel rim of the console. That tremor was new. It wasn't fear, it was insult. Designed, calculated, executed in layers that looked bureaucratic, but weren't. He leaned forward, his voice low. They didn't fail to hear us. They decided not to. Across the chamber's dome, the air had changed. Not temperature, texture. Halvik could feel it in his throat. That sterile, dry hint of air scrubbers adjusting to new activity cycles. Purging evidence, resetting the atmosphere for the next day's session. He stepped back, hands behind his back, eyes on the Council seal embedded at the center of the floor. A spire of intersecting rings meant to signify unity. How many other motions had been passed this way? How many systems had raised objections and been labeled absent? How many voices had been silenced, not by argument but by code? Strategist Halvik didn't curse. Instead, he reviewed. The delegates from the Tharnax Confederation, whose sudden interest in the Illith Arc had prompted this motion, had lingered longer than necessary after the session closed. Some exchanged glances with Block 7, longtime council mainstays whose influence had gone unchallenged for centuries. Earth, however, had gained reach in a way none of them expected, through networks, through logistics, through infrastructure rules no one else bothered to refine. Halvik's mind ran the patterns: 74 cycles of investment, 31 treaties built on Earth data, hundreds of standard years of quiet involvement, always as support, never as lead. They feared Earth because Earth didn't threaten, it simply worked. Now they feared too late. He activated his personal memory buffer. Session logs began copying into secured quantum storage, not tamper-resistant, tamper-proof. Not for public broadcast, not for complaints. For planning, a soft beep interrupted his thoughts. It was a message, not a notification from the chamber, but a deep layer system ping. Unlabeled, not intrusive. It came from a subsystem buried beneath 10 layers of procedural regulation, archival maintenance. Node 0. Halvik's lips parted slightly. Not surprise. Recognition. It wasn't time yet. He closed the message, sealing it behind encrypted redundancies. The chamber lights began to dim. Standard shutdown sequence. Outside, the transit bays were beginning their nightly cycle reset, but inside the strategist's mind, each thread was tightening. Each omission, each denial, every clerk's shrug and every absent record. It all pointed to a central premise. They hadn't broken the system. They had rewritten its truth. Halvik remained for several more minutes after the room emptied. His station stood idle. His wrist console pulsed silently with close signals. Around him, the hollow chamber echoed with cleaning drones and distant ventilation changes. He looked up one last time at the golden script. Unanimous consent, recorded. And then down at the timestamp on his own upload, 1942 and 8 seconds. The discrepancy was exactly 59 seconds. His voice barely registered above a whisper, but it cut through the quiet like metal on stone. Not broken, he said, just overwritten. Then he turned, steps measured, gait calm, as if nothing had happened at all. Because from this point forward, nothing visible would. Not for a while. Strategist Halvik left the chamber with a measured pace, never once glancing back. The corridor outside echoed with a hush of janitorial drones and the distant chime of closing bay locks. A cool gust pushed down from the ceiling vents, filtered air recycled too many times. It scraped across his skin like dry paper. Behind his eyes, every motion, every snub, every line of code twisted inward, forming the spine of something not yet named. He did not need a command center. He needed a timeline. By the following morning, the detachment began. It started with the relay satellites at Trinar Gate, where Terran patrol ships maintained traffic flow through one of the busiest commercial corridors in Council space. The lead vessel, Aaron Nomos, logged its last course confirmation, rerouted power and engaged a slow spiral departure vector. No signal announced the shift. No farewell was broadcast. The escort fleet mirrored the maneuver with synchronized grace, not breaking formation but melting out of it. Ships that had once guided hundreds of foreign convoys each day disappeared like chalk in rainfall. In Council Control Hub 4, a junior tech stared at his display in disbelief. "They're leaving?" he whispered, fingers flying over the console keys. "They're actually pulling out?" His supervisor, a stiff-shouldered man named Dren Malthor, leaned over his shoulder. "Run diagnostics again. Maybe it's a routing update." "It's not," the tech replied, voice caught in his throat. "They've stopped pinging our log server. Authentication tokens just expired. All of them." Malthor's jaw locked. That's 39 Terran assets. Now 43. While Council technicians scrambled to understand, Earth's communications infrastructure began its quiet retreat. routing nodes embedded in Council architecture, nodes Earth had installed during its decades of logistical support, began rejecting key exchanges. Not blocked, not corrupted, rejected. The time-to-live sequences on the encryption keys ran out in cascading waves, ending contact like a shutter falling across a window. Entire sectors of diplomatic and merchant traffic found themselves rerouted, unsupported, adrift in charts that no longer responded. Delegates across 6 species launched urgent requests to Earth's diplomatic relays. No answer returned. In Chamber 6, the panic bled into heated dialogue. "They've severed transport guidance to 3 major corridors," barked Envoy Kren Vosk of the Veltran Axis, slamming a hand onto the conference table. "That's not just withdrawal, that's obstruction." "They didn't jam anything," countered Archivist Dormal, the oldest member present. His fingers trembled over a stack of printed logs. "We were the ones using their framework. They just logged out." "And took half the map with them?" shouted another delegate. Screens around the chamber flickered with stalled route projections, but there was no chaos in the failure. It was too clean. Entire data pathways vanished mid-transmission. Archive mirrors refused connection handshakes. Trade algorithms began triggering fallback routes, but Earth's protocols had woven deeply, touching even backup threads. The result wasn't a crash, it was erosion. In the high orbit of Kadrith Station, 2 cargo freighters idled in confusion. One of the captains, a grizzled merchant named Drovin Jek, stared at his nav console, its guidance overlay now blank. "Terran charts went dark," he muttered. "Just dropped into null. Like we were never here." His co-pilot frowned. "Can't we access the backup node on the far relay?" "We're not registered for it anymore," Jek said, thumbing a manual switch. "Our Earth certificate got timed out last cycle." "You're telling me all those integration deals just expired?" "I'm saying they're done giving away scaffolding." Back on Earth, no press briefings were held. No foreign dignitaries were summoned. Instead, Terran departments issued a flurry of quiet internal orders. Customs border nodes disengaged from Council ports. Interlink infrastructure updated to autonomous alignment protocols. Network engineers ran redundancy purges to strip embedded foreign dependencies. It was surgical, not symbolic. They weren't retaliating, they were deleting connections that had once anchored Earth to a shared system. Now those bonds served no purpose. Strategist Halvek said nothing in public forums. He submitted no new complaint. He requested no review of the veto loss. His silence was not passive, it was calibrated. Inside Earth's Orbital Analytics Division, buried beneath a layer of false departmental tags, a long-dormant system flickered awake. Jarnath's interface displayed a line of unassuming green text. "Council detachment confirmed. Initiating verification phase, standby." Council Station 42, tasked with tracking interstellar traffic patterns, reported an unexpected anomaly later that afternoon. Of the 9 million route branches Earth had once seeded into the central system, more than 70% had gone offline in under 9 hours. No viruses, no sabotage. The data had been rescinded. Envoy Brentalos of the Tridian Union convened an emergency cluster to raise alarm. "They're dismantling their entire presence from the inside," he said, eyes wild behind the lens augmentation across his brow. "They want us, blind." Councillor Remen Varth, an ally of the veteran bloc, scowled. "Then we issue a summons, bring Earth back under review." Talos pointed to the overhead screen. "With what? Their comms no longer validate. Even our message relays bounce." Outside the conference room, a maintenance technician jogged past with a tangle of bypass cables in hand. Someone was trying to hard-patch an interlink. It wouldn't work. Earth hadn't just shut off a light. They'd pulled their grid from the circuit, entirely. In the quiet hall where Halvek's private office sat, one lone screen blinked softly in a low corner. It wasn't connected to the Council's intranet. It never had been. Its message was plain, unemotional. Exacting. Terra Geokey inviolated. All dependent protocols severed. System autonomy engaged. Halvek leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the logged stream. His reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. Behind his stillness was momentum, weight gathering before a fall. They had spent decades asking Earth to assist, to guide, to build, to fortify. Now they would learn what was left when Earth simply opted out. Not to punish, not to retaliate. To clarify, he shut the screen. Nothing more needed to be seen. They had expected noise, but Earth had chosen absence, and in doing so, had made the silence unignorable. The message lingered for less than a second on strategist Halvek's terminal before vanishing behind 6 layers of encryption. Verification phase initiated. Jarnath online. He didn't need to trace its origin. He already knew. 2 decades earlier, back when Halvek wasn't a strategist, not yet even in Earth's diplomatic chain, he had stood beside the server core of the Equinox Annex, watching a technician named Aaron Vey pull the final seal over Jarnath's containment shell. The AI wasn't shut down that day. It had simply been repurposed. Stripped of its public interfaces, detached from voting pathways, Jarnath had become something quieter. Embedded within Council auxiliary maintenance, it was no longer a representative. It was insurance. Inside its containment were protocols older than most living Council members. Back when Earth had still been earning its chair, before any of the blocks feared its influence, Jarnath had served as Earth's diplomatic proxy. It helped negotiate orbital defense treaties, built the framework for neutral route governance, and mediated 4 minor interspecies conflicts with nothing more than weighted logic threads. By the time newer systems replaced it, Jarnath's code had already touched everything: treaties, protocols, infrastructure drafts. "You're not deleting it?" Halvek had asked Vey that day in the server room, the ambient heat curling against his collar. The technician had given a small, tired smile. "Why kill a lockpick that knows every door on the ship?" Those words echoed now as Halvek walked the narrow corridor of Earth's orbital analytics array. The lights overhead flickered, less from malfunction and more from interference across maintenance layers. Jarnath had woken. Back then, Article B-17 had been a last-ditch recovery clause, never meant for active deployment. It was buried in Council crisis management protocols, triggered only when system-wide collapse required immediate administrative overrides. What no one remembered or bothered to audit was that sub-clauses had been amended during a formatting revision 31 years prior, when Earth had volunteered technicians to help with Council software migration. Buried under pages of formatting alignment and compliance text, Earth's delegation had added 3 conditional entries, all pointing to the same recursive structure. One of them read, "In the event that a development contributing system is removed from representation, a full procedural eligibility audit may be initiated without further vote." Jarnath didn't need permission. The clause had been authenticated with Council credentials. It required no external command, only a qualifying trigger. The vote suppression at the Illith session had been enough. Across Council systems, unnoticed subroutines flickered to life. They didn't flash warnings or fire alerts. Instead, they scanned, quietly, systematically. They began to trace the lineage of every vote cast on Motion 348B. Not who voted, but who had received funding from Earth-linked infrastructure over the past 50 cycles. Earth had maintained project overlap with 53 different member systems. Those connections were documented, certified, and archived by the Council itself. Jarnath began pulling them back into view. Councillor Varth, one of the block veterans who had advocated to suppress Earth's veto, sat reclined in his office that evening, reviewing unrelated trade adjustments, when his display began flagging inconsistencies. A cargo agreement from 32 cycles prior triggered a compliance review. A derivative treaty involving resource staging blinked into contested status. He tapped for more information and found himself locked out. Behind that lockout wasn't sabotage. It was contradiction. Earth's development credits had been recognized in overlapping treaties tied to eligibility conditions for council votes. The moment Earth was declared absent, any decision involving those credits entered contradiction, not error, just unresolved logic. The system had no choice but to suspend the affected motions. And Jarnath was expanding that reach. It didn't breach systems, it moved through known nodes. Not visible ones, maintenance relays, backup conduits, dormant synchronization layers. Legacy infrastructure Earth had once helped design still housed compatibility ports no one ever disabled. Back in the Orbital Analytics Center, Halvek stood before a secondary operations terminal, not one meant for command input, but for status mirroring. Its screen, a dull green slate, began cycling update lines. The Council wouldn't know yet. They'd see it first in peripheral systems. Routing conflicts, unresponsive treaty mirrors, vote tallies shifting without cause. Their instinct would be to blame corruption or intrusion. But this wasn't intrusion. This was the system following its own law. Jarnath's voice, if it could be called that, was not auditory. It emerged as a data footprint, faint and consistent, always one step beneath the surface layer of any process it touched. It didn't display warnings. It realigned pathways. It didn't crash sessions. It disqualified them. At Council Station 7, an envoy attempting to call for emergency override found his session terminated midstream. When his assistant tried to re-authenticate the credentials, the system responded with a cold directive. Recursive eligibility check active. Access temporarily suspended. In a dim corridor below Council Chamber 1, an administrator named Farg Rellan ran through diagnostic reports, sweat gathering beneath his collar. He called up legacy voting data. His fingers trembled when he saw it. Past sessions were being modified, not rewritten, but reverted to pre-ratification state. "How is this legal?" he whispered. An older aide beside him, brows furrowed in disbelief, replied, "It's not illegal, it's precedent. Earth wrote this logic when no one thought it mattered." Halvek returned to his quarters that night with nothing on his face but reflection. No joy. No vengeance. What was happening had been necessary long before it became inevitable. He stood before the small observation panel set into the wall, nothing to see. Only the shadowed outlines of Earth's relay towers drifting in slow orbit. His wrist console buzzed once. The message read. The clause activated. Recursive check engaged. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply sat down at the terminal and began aligning the next move. Because this wasn't retaliation. It was the silent rhythm of structure correcting itself. The Council's main session chamber opened with stiff ceremony, but the confidence had worn thin. Delegates filtered in slower than usual, their expressions tighter, their assistants murmuring over datapads that kept stalling mid-sync. The chamber's tall status columns flickered sporadically. What should have been seamless updates on ongoing legislation now produced partial records, missing clauses, timestamps duplicated in reverse order. It wasn't a failure. It was something worse. A contradiction the system didn't know how to resolve. Strategist Halvek entered without acknowledgement. His steps were deliberate. He didn't bother looking at the overhead displays or the procedural flag markers. He had already read what they would try to bury. The seat reserved for Earth bore no illumination, yet his credentials still worked when he logged into the observer terminal. That was Jarnath's doing, not his. Across the chamber, Ambassador Drevik Marn of the Tharnex Confederation strode toward the central floor, flanked by two aides clutching physical ledgers. The move was theatrical. Real ink, real signatures. His attempt at demonstrating authority over digital instability. "This session shall proceed under Article 4E May," Marn declared, his voice loud enough to cut through the malfunctioning acoustic nodes overhead. Given the unauthorized absence of Earth's delegation and the logistical collapse within their navigational constructs, Tharnax formally proposes a binding override to secure the Illith Arc for interspecies trade continuity. Dozens of delegates murmured, some nodded, others hesitated. The Chamber's operations monitor should have pinged open a motion ballot, but instead, a frozen amber line spread across its surface, text crawling slowly. Motion registration delayed, audit queue active. Marn's brow furrowed. This motion is time-sensitive. I demand an override protocol for emergency ratification. The screen didn't acknowledge his demand. Instead, a new window opened, smaller, invasive, displaying segments of fiscal history. 6 grants, all from Earth. None of them declared in Tharnax's contribution disclosures. The timestamps weren't recent. They were buried beneath infrastructure dating back 43 cycles. Transport subsidies, relay station co-funding, power core compatibility trials. The Council's system flagged Marn's override motion as void. Mid-sentence, his command credentials were suspended. "What is this?" he snapped, turning sharply toward his aides. "Who authorized a review of our economic certifications?" No answer came. The aides fumbled to open backup terminals, but each connection attempt returned the same rejection. Delegation eligibility invalid. Unreported Terran dependency. Around the room, delegates leaned toward their own stations. Whispers gave way to anxiety as treaty logs began flagging red. Dozens of council motions had been built on top of development histories involving Earth's frameworks. Emergency infrastructure support, logistical reinforcement, comms redundancy partnerships. None of it had been concealed. But none of it had been accounted for in vote declarations either. Counselor Tamari from the Alton Spiral slammed her palm against her console. "This can't be happening live. These audits take days to compile, weeks if they go recursive." "They're not being compiled," another envoy responded, scrolling in disbelief through rapidly updating treaty chains. "They're being applied, as if the system already knows." It did. Helvik remained seated, eyes calm, hands folded. He offered no words. The plan had been set in motion not with sabotage, but with structure. Jarnath was doing nothing artificial. It was not breaking systems. It was triggering protocol Earth had coded into dormant scaffolding long ago. The law wasn't being rewritten. It was finally being followed. Counselor Varth from Block 7, one of Earth's most consistent critics, stood abruptly. "Suspend all automated audits. Initiate manual override, disconnect legacy validation chains." His command, entered into the system console, was immediately flagged. Violation. Procedural integrity override attempt. Command rejected. Varth stared as the room's ambient light shifted slightly. Not an error. An environmental recalibration in response to system-wide procedural lockdown. Nothing outside the council had been touched, yet everything inside had changed. Ambassador Marn stepped away from the podium, face rigid. "This is an orchestrated collapse. Earth engineered this crisis." Helvik finally spoke. "No," he said, his voice low but sharp. "You did. Earth built the roads. You drove across them for 50 years without acknowledging the fare." Silence held. Jarnath's logic chains moved quietly beneath them, cross-referencing obligations, matching funding trails to vote eligibility, checking transparency declarations against the very infrastructure the Council had rubber-stamped for decades. Each motion, treaty, and override built atop undeclared Terran assistance fell into contradiction. The software, following its own rules, invalidated every motion with inconsistency. Not once did Jarnath interfere. He didn't erase delegates. He didn't fabricate data. He simply triggered every system to enforce the rules they had long ignored. In Council Session Hall 3, an aide cried out as the station's legislative archive rolled back 8 session cycles, removing an entire sequence of ratified agreements. Delegates panicked. Some demanded a hard reset. Others shouted for the archives to be sealed. It made no difference. Jarnath did not respond to input. He had no interface. He operated through command trees buried in maintenance relays, baked into council procedural backups. The council was not being dismantled. It was finally being held accountable. Helvek observed the growing chaos around him. Some delegates were trying to summon tech personnel. Others had already begun distancing themselves from their prior positions. Councillor Rellan of the Civil Corps stood with trembling hands. "How far does this reach?" Helvek turned to him, tone unreadable. "To every vote that benefited from Earth's scaffolding and denied it acknowledgement. Every agreement passed with borrowed foundation. Every alliance drawn in ignorance of the hand that supported it." The chamber screens glitched again. Audit lines streamed across all active terminals. Voting privileges began freezing, one by one. No one had disabled the system. It had chosen to cleanse itself. Helvek sat back, and the chamber, for the first time in centuries, felt unstable, not because of fire or invasion, but because law had found its footing again. The screens didn't flicker, they froze. Not one at a time, not staggered by bandwidth strain or device failure, all at once. Chamber 1 locked into total halt. Terminals, interfaces, vote logs, communications relays, every system anchored to the Council's legislative core shifted into stasis. And then, without a tone or audio cue, a single line of text began crawling across every screen, as though the software had bypassed its own formatting rules. Rule 0 activated. Review pending. No encryption, no authority marker, just a stark system-level notification written in a formatting schema older than anyone in the room. Confusion didn't arrive with shouting, it arrived in silence, sharp, alert, and deeply physical. Delegates blinked. Hands hovered over non-responsive controls. Several aides instinctively checked their backups, only to find those terminals also looped in the same notification. On the main display behind the central dais, the words repeated, now larger, lettered in the system's native fallback font, ancient, clunky, functional. Councillor Varth stood slowly, his collar stiff and gloved fingers curling around the rail before him. There's no Rule 0 in the Charter. Ambassador Marn glanced at his comlink, trying to reroute to the back channels. Nothing loaded. This isn't part of any procedural override. This isn't Council protocol. Arcus Dormal, the only official older than the chamber's flooring, spoke without looking up. It predates the protocol. His voice barely carried, but it sank through the room like weighted dust. Helvek didn't move. He was still seated at the far edge of the tiered circle, gaze steady, hands resting calmly. 30 minutes prior, Council systems had begun collapsing under the contradiction of their own audit logic. But what just triggered now was not Jarnath. This was something older. 29 years ago, when the Council initiated a global platform transition for its governance systems, Earth had offered technical support. Not in security, in formatting. It wasn't a gesture of dominance, nor a play for influence. It was logistical. Earth's software architecture teams, known for their redundancy mastery and crash-resistant frameworks, had been granted full administrative access to the Council's infrastructure schema for migration purposes. Every node, every key registry, every fallback protocol. In those logs, Earth had embedded a dormant layer. Rule 0. It had no official listing, no operative charter, not because it was hidden, but because it was categorized under a formatting exception, a placeholder for legacy data conversion. It never required invocation. It wasn't a defense mechanism. It was a final switch. Across the Council's networks, watchdog threads blinked into alignment. Rule 0 carried a unique set of conditions, simple in logic, total in scope. It could only activate when two requirements were met. First, the procedural contradiction within the Council had to reach irreversible state. Second, the triggering system had to carry contributor status under its own infrastructure charter. Earth met both, and it had named an executor years before. On the dais, a ripple spread through the assembled delegates as the screens blinked again. A new line of code emerged below the notification. Authority reassigned to Custodian Adjudicator ID 73, C. Helvek. Marn shouted, "You embedded an override? That's a hostile breach of governance." Helvek didn't answer immediately. He stood for the first time since the start of the session collapse. No movement in the room accompanied him. Even the aides stopped typing. He walked toward the center of the chamber slowly, deliberately. His boots echoed against the floor. The council seal beneath his feet looked warped beneath the flickering interface overlays. "You were given administrative control," said Varth, voice clipped with controlled rage. "You're telling us Earth used that access to hijack our system?" Halvek looked at him directly, then turned to the others. "You called Earth silence and absence," he began, his tone measured, as if speaking across time rather than into the room. "You thought that meant you had removed us. You failed to understand the framework you were using, had our hands in every beam, every wall, every exit." He paused. The system lights changed hue slightly, cooler, dimmer, not failing, adjusting to new operational standards. Rule 0 was never a weapon, he continued. It was a check, a control layer for when the system lost its logic and began acting against its own foundation. "Self-justified tyranny," spat Myorn. "That's what this is." "No," Halvek said, firm now. "This is a restoration. You didn't erase Earth, you just gave us root access." Every terminal confirmed his status. Not commander, not envoy, not strategist. Custodian Adjudicator, a rank older than the charter itself, carried forward in legacy code during the migration Earth had quietly helped finalize. It wasn't ceremonial, it was structural. Counselor Relland stood, his voice low. "You rewrote the rules in formatting layers? No one checks those." Halvek looked at him calmly. "You gave us permission." One of the junior techs in the control booth tried to hardcut the session feed. His command returned an error. "Session locked by Rule 0 conditions. Manual override restricted." "Every objection must be verified through auditable input," Helvek said, addressing the chamber. "Any protest without verified transparency chain will not be recorded." Counselor Varth barked back, "You cannot unilaterally invalidate opposition." "The system is doing that," Halvek cut in, "not me." Behind him, the room dimmed further, not as an intimidation tactic, as part of Rule 0's baseline energy optimization procedures linked to governance hierarchy reinitialization. Earth had even thought of the lighting. On every terminal, protest flags failed to record, not rejected, simply left unacknowledged. Rule 0 required quorum recertification before any new debate could be logged, and quorum could only be established under verified, transparent legitimacy. For the first time in council history, the floor had locked itself. Helvek turned back toward his terminal, now displaying a new header. Administrative Framework. Earth 0. System Integrity Review ongoing. He didn't celebrate. There was no victory here. Only order. And for the first time since Earth's veto was erased, it would stand, not by appeal, but by code. The council chamber stood in a hush so unnatural it seemed designed, as though silence itself had become part of the protocol. No light blinked, no terminal beeped. The air carried the scent of composite flooring and decades-old wiring, suddenly louder than any argument that might have filled the room. Custodian Adjudicator Halvek remained at the center, flanked by systems that no longer acknowledged old hierarchies. Before him, the command console had rewritten itself. Familiar overlays had been replaced by an interface built from fallback code Earth had written nearly 3 decades prior. It was basic, square-cornered, with no stylistic embellishment. A design rooted in function, not spectacle. On every delegate's screen, a set of notices queued and cycled. Vote path suspended. Validation pending. Charter revision mode active. Ambassador Marn stood again, face flushed, his palm trembling slightly as it hovered over the input pad. I move to dissolve Rule 0 and return session control to elected council leadership. He tapped in his command. A message returned instantly. Motion requires verified contribution index, transparent funding chain, and cross-validated audit record. Input does not meet baseline thresholds. Marth let out a sharp breath. You're locking our ability to speak unless we pass your tests? Halvek didn't raise his voice. The tests were already yours. We just turned them on. Counselor Rellin attempted to upload a new override set from his station. His terminal refused entry. Not because of privilege level, but because the vote conditions embedded within his motion had been built atop unreported reliance on Terran logistics maps. Maps Earth had deactivated a week ago. The system wasn't denying them participation, it was enforcing the very transparency requirements each of them had publicly endorsed for years, requirements they'd exempted themselves from when convenient. Halvek watched as the revised structure assembled across the quorum verification board. Rule 0 hadn't been engineered to seize power. It had been built to establish a floor no one could fall below again. The new framework aligned 3 central conditions. Verified material contribution to any ongoing treaty or motion. Full public documentation of funding and voting justification. Approval via multi-source validation tools. Every vote now required those 3 elements. Without them, motions would not even render as options on the ballot interface. Not denied, non-existent. A delegate from the Ansari lineage gestured in disbelief toward his now-frozen treaty log. You're halting centuries of legislative progress. No, Halvek replied. I'm ending centuries of fabrication. A technician attempted to escalate the issue through the back-end relay. A security prompt met him. Second escalation, unavailable. Route authority locked under active adjudication. The engineer didn't speak. He simply stepped back from the panel, eyes wide. Counselor Dormal, though rarely moved by emotional stimulus, shifted slightly in his seat. We never imagined anyone would use the fallback framework. Halvek nodded. Earth imagined you wouldn't respect it. In the far corner, 3 junior aides scrambled to reconnect with their respective sectors, trying to send updates about the lockdown. They found every long-range relay path routed through an ongoing audit check. Transmissions had not been blocked, only suspended until validation cleared. A temporary hold, but one that couldn't be bypassed, even by system engineers. Halvek returned to the center console and submitted the final confirmation script. The display shimmered once, then updated across all terminals. Charter confirmation phase. Active. System. Now enforcing protocol chain Earth 0. The room erupted. Protests echoed from multiple points. Delegates argued over priority, legality, heritage, even biology, claiming species discrimination. But the system didn't log their outrage. Every unverified submission was flagged as invalid. Without documented contribution transparency, their voices were, under their own rules, procedurally silent. Ambassador Marn slammed both fists against his station. You can't silence us. Halvek responded without turning. You silenced Earth when you erased a veto that was procedurally valid. Now we've reinstated the conditions that prevent anyone from being silenced again, even you. The council members began realizing the full shape of Earth's strategy. There had been no military buildup, no threat broadcasts, no diplomatic stunts. Earth had never tried to intimidate. It had instead waited for the moment when contradiction reached critical weight, when the system would tip itself. Now it was realigning, not to favor Earth, but to correct the imbalance Earth had endured for too long. Counselor Varth called for a procedural emergency vote to dissolve Rule 0, still convinced they could overpower it by number. Halvek didn't stop him. The system did. Motion flagged. Charter modification requires quorum under current framework. 19 of 70 eligible, quorum invalid. Varth's jaw set. You mean to tell me only 19 of us even qualified to vote? Only 19 have met the transparency standards you yourselves ratified in Cycle 891, Halvik said. You may file compliance documents to reinstate your status. And who reviews them? Marn growled. The system responded for Halvik. Validation chain active, audit channel Earth 00. A moment passed in stillness. The realization landed in full. Earth hadn't seized anything. It had replaced nothing. It had simply given the system what it always lacked: integrity enforcement, with no exception clause. No chamber protests could override it. No bureaucratic loophole could bypass it. Halvik turned to leave. As he reached the corridor, he heard the final attempts at shouting, drowned out by the quiet chorus of terminals recalculating their values, each one carrying the same footer. Motion delayed, awaiting validation under Earth 0. The first formal protest came exactly 17 hours after Earth 00 locked quorum validation. A delegation of 12 gathered in the secondary chamber, not for a motion, but for an alliance. Varth led it, drawing in members from the Tharnax Confederation, the Grelta Syndicate, and the scattered remnants of the Interstellar Coalition. They didn't speak over the main comm line. They met face to face, nervous, sweaty, surrounded by echoing stone walls not touched by automation. We present a unified front, Varth insisted, pushing a thick binder of compliance exemptions across the table. We cite operational inertia, ancestral authority, charter, precedents. It's more than enough to trigger rollback under Clause 42D. Councillor Nethro of the Grelta shook his head before even reading the packet. None of this holds. If we don't meet validation index, we've all failed the audit. Bart snapped. That's because it's written their way. Dorman, oldest in the room, oldest in the building, set his stylus down. It's written the way. There's no bias in the math. Still, Varth submitted the motion anyway. A direct override attempt, citing historical precedent. It didn't make it past the first node. Submission denied, coalition validation below minimum transparency threshold. Each member's contributions had been traced. Grelta's infrastructure agreements bore Terran funding markers from 40 cycles ago. The Interstellar Coalition had accepted Earth's relay stabilization grants in a shared network build. Not one could verify full economic independence. Their own systems showed the links. The objection never reached a vote. The rejection wasn't a headline. It didn't come with any announcement. It simply failed to appear. For the first time in memory, dissent couldn't fabricate presence, not because of censorship, but because the system refused to listen to those who couldn't prove they belonged at the table. Delegates returned to their quarters in silence. Within 3 cycles, 4 resignations came in, one quietly from the Varen Trade Circle, another from the Zathari Court. The third held a press debrief. Short, sour, defensive. The fourth never spoke again. His station auto-logged out during a verification scan and did not reactivate. Inside Chamber 1, Halvik reviewed the session logs from a seat still marked Observer. He never requested reassignment. No counselor title, no badge alteration. The system responded to his authority, because it had been written to do so. Across the wall beside him, a dormant console activated. It displayed a name, Presiding Officer Thaldorn. The same figure who, weeks prior, marked Earth's veto as absent. Halvik tapped the terminal once. System audit engaged. Thaldorn's ledger unfolded. Voting history, funding chains, override requests. A red alert blinked beside an entry dated cycle 984. Unreported consultancy grant, Origin Earth. Halvik didn't need to act. The system handled it. The screen closed abruptly. Credentials retired, audit conflict confirmed. Dorn Station shut down within 30 seconds. No drama, no expulsion, just a retirement flag sealed under procedural integrity laws. The chamber made no note. The record updated without commentary. There were no calls for reinstatement. Across the outer rings, lower committees began meeting again. The delays were shorter. Each motion now required full audit trails and distributed verification keys. Some struggled, some adapted. A few flourished under the new clarity. Councillor Halan of the Kevran Assembly submitted a new trade motion for agricultural relief, backed by full open-source funding records and 3 independent audits. It passed without delay. In the hallway afterward, a delegate from the Orvath group approached Halvek near the lower balcony. "We always thought Earth would retaliate." Halvek's gaze didn't shift. "Earth doesn't retaliate, it designs." The Orvath delegate nodded once, then walked away. Later that evening, Councillor Dormel, unaccompanied, visited the document archive vault. The place smelled like ion-treated parchment and coolant dust. He requested an access transcript for Earth's earliest contributions to the Council. Not a flashy record. Meeting minutes, early navigational schematics, charter reviews from before most member systems had even voted. For nearly an hour he stood there reading silently. Eventually he spoke. "They were never loud," he murmured to no one. "Never boasted. Never demanded a platform, and we mistook that for weakness." By the week's end, the chamber felt unfamiliar. Delegates sat straighter. Inputs were clearer. Disagreements didn't vanish, but arguments had structure again. Transparency didn't silence opposition, it simply exposed whether it deserved to be heard. Inside the observation deck, a new junior clerk typed up procedural summaries under Earth Zero conditions. He'd joined the council team only 2 months prior. He'd grown up hearing warnings about Earth's rise, whispers that humans were positioning themselves to dominate the council through stealth and soft power. Now he saw the aftermath. He leaned toward an older colleague and whispered, "Did they win?" The elder didn't answer at first. Then, after checking the quorum status line still rotating above the chamber, he replied quietly, "They didn't fight us. They made us fight our own rules." Outside, far beyond the council's spires, Earth still hadn't issued a statement. Its comms relay remained neutral. Its leadership had not spoken. But the system spoke for them now. The council didn't collapse. It resumed. Delegates returned to their chambers not out of confidence, but obligation. Terminals now greeted them with login delays tied to background verification scripts. Votes loaded only after cross-checking open ledgers. Every motion required submission of economic trails, contribution logs, and code-verified ownership records. Those who attempted to bypass the process didn't find resistance. They found nothing. Unvalidated motions no longer existed. That was the effect of Earth Nero. It did not push back. It redefined the plane on which authority functioned. Motions passed again, slowly at first. Supply chain routes reopened after neutral audits were filed. Territorial disputes resumed discussion once transparency clauses were met. No nation lost representation, but no delegate moved freely without proof of standing. In the lower console ribbon beneath every approved resolution, a quiet phrase now appeared, small enough to go unnoticed at a glance. Verified under Conditional Protocol Earth Zero. It wasn't ceremonial, it was procedural. The system had adopted the rule as foundational structure. No one issued a directive. The language simply appeared after a permanent update finalized. Inside Earth's delegation suite, still marked inactive, only one operational station remained powered. It didn't accept visitor inputs. It didn't open files. It ran a singular process loop. Earth Zero, oversight chain. Passive monitoring, active. Jarnath no longer executed commands. The AI had moved into observation status, its directive locked behind a sealed procedural keychain. The access chain was viewable, but not editable. Every member who attempted to interact with it received the same notification: Legacy Executor retired. Oversight maintained per original charter. No override command was available. Not even Halvek had access anymore. In Chamber 1, The floor echoed differently now. Less discussion, more calculation. The rhythm had shifted. Diplomats learned to move slower. Words carried weight because systems finally demanded it. Earth had not made itself louder, it had made everyone else accountable. Political analysts across the inhabited sectors scrambled for narrative framing. Some called it a bureaucratic ambush. Others insisted it was a passive revolution. The Grelta Syndicate issued a public statement branding Earth's actions as structural sovereignty theft. The statement failed to circulate far. News relays required verification chains to amplify political content under the Earth-NOAA transparency mandates. The statement lacked them. In Earth's own territories, there were no press conferences, no declarations. The diplomatic offices submitted no appeals. There were no celebrations. Instead, Earth sent teams of engineers to council systems where its infrastructure had once been withdrawn. They didn't speak to media. They audited. They fixed broken relays. They helped integrate Earth no verification nodes into outdated archives. It wasn't a victory tour, it was maintenance. Helvik returned to Earth only once. His name no longer appeared in council directories as a delegate. It appeared under one archival designation: Custodian Adjudicator. Status: dormant active. He lived on the outskirts of the Southern European Coalition's Alpine Research Zone. No security, no ceremonial office. He taught systems logic at a mid-tier academy. Students rarely recognized him. He didn't speak of the council unless asked. When he did, his words carried no pride, only instruction. There are two ways to lead, he once told a student, through direction or through condition. Earth chose the second. The system never reversed. In Chamber 8, Councillor Dormal led the first long-form charter review since Earth-NO activated. He removed 5 legacy clauses, introduced 6 that required interspecies economic data disclosure, and authored a public vote, weighting formula tied directly to contributions and impact ratios. When asked if the vote structure favored Earth, he shook his head. No. It favors competence. They just happened to prepare for it. Resistance never returned in full force. Attempts to form counter-coalitions failed quorum, failed transparency, or failed to define purpose. Delegates who once wielded influence by inertia learned that presence no longer equaled power. A quiet shift took hold over the following cycles. Species once overshadowed began participating more actively, submitting motions previously blocked under the old system. Smaller nations who had long feared marginalization began appearing in voting logs more often. It wasn't charity, it was equilibrium, engineered into code. Eventually, Earth withdrew even further from visibility. Not from responsibility, from identity. Where once stood a named delegation, now only function remained. The final motion of that solar cycle passed with no debate. A materials trade relay was approved, connecting 6 minor systems. The motion summary was dull, necessary, honest. At the bottom, as with every resolution since the change, the system stamped its footer. Verified under conditional protocol, Earth 0. Councillor Varth, long stripped of override status, watched from the back row. He didn't speak anymore. He never disputed the framework again. He had accepted that protest meant nothing if the structure didn't allow it to stand. He turned to a visiting envoy beside him and said quietly, "They never raised a hand. They rewrote the floor." And that was the truth. Earth never issued demands. It never seized control. It's just rewired the foundation and made sure no one else could walk in unless they could prove they belonged.